Hi, everybody, and welcome to another AIA Colorado Virtual Connect. Today's session features a presentation on significant changes to the ICC A117.1 Accessibility Standards in the 2017 edition. I encourage you to use the chat box to ask questions, and I'll help moderate the discussion after the presentation. In addition, AIA members will earn one AIA CES Health, Safety, and Welfare Learning Unit for participating in today's webinar. It is my pleasure now to introduce our speaker today. I want to welcome Joshua Kleiber from Code Unlimited. Hi, Josh.
Hello there. It'll take a second for my camera to come up. There it is.
There we are. Hi.
Hi.
Josh is an accessibility specialist with Code Unlimited. He has been leading the accessibility plan reviews and inspections for Code Unlimited for the last 8 years. Joshua's worked on everything from small restaurant tenant improvements to military boarding school renovations. And having worked with a wide variety of architects, developers, and facility managers in multiple states, he brings a breadth of knowledge to every project. In addition, he has a curiosity for the gray areas of the code and the various design possibilities within them. We are grateful to have Code Unlimited as a sponsoring partner at AIA Colorado. In addition to providing quality continuing education webinars and being affiliated with our signature events, AIA Colorado partners allow us to offer many of these programs at no cost to our members. So thanks also to Code Unlimited. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Joshua to tell us more about what's coming in the new accessibility standards. Take it away, Joshua.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Just a little bit about me and Code Unlimited. I've been working in accessibility for about 8-9 years now with Code Unlimited, doing projects all over the Northwest and also there in Colorado. Not only do we do accessibility, but pretty much anything that is code or regulatory related, including fire life safety, fire protection engineering, OSHA occasionally. All sorts of stuff. Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to brag too much about all the various other things we do. But if you ever need any help with permitting or code, we do that kind of thing. All right, so on to the presentation. So today we're going to be talking about significant changes to the 2017 version of the A117.1. This was published obviously in 2017, but is only really now starting to become applicable as it gets adopted into various jurisdictions and areas. And there's some pretty big changes in it. So that's why we're doing this presentation. Quick overview of what we'll be talking about today: application administration, building blocks or kind of essential elements, kind of the basics that could apply to various other parts of the code. Accessible routes, general site and building elements, plumbing elements and facilities, basically what's happening and changing in the bathrooms, communication elements. So there's been some changes in signage, special rooms and spaces such that like saunas, places like that. There's been a couple clarifications. Getting into recreational facilities, dwelling, sleeping units. I pretty much ordered all of this by how it's organized in A117. So that way it's kind of in a logical order for you. Also kind of created this rating system, just so that way you can be aware of like, okay, is this something I really need to pay attention to? That'd be a high impact change. Whether this is something that I should kind of like put in the back of my head and like, oh, there was something that was changed to that. It affects not necessarily all of my projects, but potentially some of them depending upon what the programming is within that building. And then there's low impact changes, which are like kind of housekeeping or language or things that were already required elsewhere in the code or are very rarely seen in projects. And I'll put this rating system on each of these changes that I discuss kind of as a guide, just for you to be aware of it. All right, and as we get into it, application administration. So as I was talking about, this is a even though it's been published and has been available, it has not really been adopted anywhere officially, as far as I'm aware. It is not referenced in the 2018 International Building Codes. So that still references the 2009 version. Hopefully it's the standard that everyone knows and loves at this point in time. It is referenced in the new 2021 IBC, which was kind of finalized earlier this year and published. I don't know if it's actually been published yet. It is available to see online. I don't think that there's the printed copy has been released yet. So the question then is, where is it applicable? Certain jurisdictions in Colorado. It gets a little bit tricky because if you take a look at the individual like cities or counties and take a look at their scoping language about which codes are adopted, the typical phrasing is the most recent published edition of the code. And that becomes like a little bit of a gray area, because if the most recent published edition of the building code is the 2018, but that doesn't reference the most recent published edition of the technical standards for accessibility, which one do you actually apply? So I would actually encourage you to contact the individual jurisdiction and say, which one are you doing? Most of the time, it's going to be the 2009. Most of the time, it's going to be the 2009, but I would verify that, because the changes that we're about to talk about will have a big impact on your design. The other places where we've been seeing this incorporated is at, let's say, activist organizations, or that are very proactive about trying to promote equality within their buildings. Typically, that's universities or other large educational campuses that will have their own internal standards. And we've been seeing the portions of this 2017 being adopted into those internal standards and being applied to all new construction, kind of wanting to be a little bit ahead of the times. But that's all the places that we've seen it currently. Most likely in Colorado, you might start seeing this probably in a year, probably within the next year, as the 2021 gets adopted by the various jurisdictions. So one of the first changes that is in this 2017 A117 is, how do you do measurements? Typically, all measurements were able to be rounded, had to be rounded up, but there are now parts of the code that says you are able to round down, but only in regards to percentages and ratios, not in terms of the numbers of what is required to be accessible. So the rounding down does not apply to parking spaces. It also does not apply to number of type A units that are required or number of accessible units that are required. And we really kind of scratched our heads about where is it percentages and ratios. And the only two places we could think of was slopes and newel posts on stairway railings. And I would highly recommend that you do not round down on slopes, because there's some confusion there. Do you round down on the 1 to 48, or do you round down on the 2%? It's not really clear, because if you round down on one dimension or the other, you're going to get different minimums that are, or maximums that are allowed. They've also changed the definition on where tolerances are now allowed. Previously, you could apply tolerances or industry standard tolerances to any measurement. And this was not in line with the ADAS. ADAS only allows tolerances on minimum, maximum, or exact dimensions. For all of you who have worked with accessibility, don't use these tolerances at all. Build your own tolerances into your drawings. because these are industry standard tolerances and they're not defined anywhere in the code, nor likely will they ever be. And so those tolerances have to be argued in court. So even though there are some changes here, I've considered it a low impact because don't want you, it's not a best practice to rely on these tolerances or rounding with a new design. All right, building blocks, the basics. Here's where we get into the big stuff. The turning signal is now bigger. It has increased from 60 inches to 67 inches in diameter. This is to accommodate the power wheelchairs that are becoming a lot more prevalent. These are larger wheelchairs and they take up more space. They don't have as tight of a turning radius and they need a bigger turning circle. So this is a huge change because if you think about like a type A unit, you're required to have a turning circle in every room. And now you have to add 7 inches to that turning space in every room, including the bathroom. The other kind of big thing to note that isn't as much talked about is that previously the 60-inch turning circle, the one on the right, you were allowed to have up to 25 inches of that be underneath an object. So in, say, a really tight bathroom, you could have the turning space be located underneath the sink up to 25 inches. The new code says you have a 10-inch maximum depth. So rather than having only having both knee and toe overlap under an obstruction, you are now only allowed to have toe overlap. And it can only be on one side. So the turning circle is a lot more restrictive at this point. Keep in mind that this is for new construction only. It does not apply for existing buildings. What are the implications of these turning circles? Type A bathrooms I've already mentioned, but also passenger loading zones are bigger. Key thing to note that elevator cars are not required to be bigger, so they didn't want to totally disrupt the entire elevator industry. But closets also are required to be bigger because of the turning spaces. These are like the walk-in closets, the ones that are more than 48 inches deep. Correspondingly, the T-shaped turning spaces are also bigger, and there's also more options. So originally, the older kind of T-shaped turning space, you could have 36 inches on all 3 legs of the T. You are no longer allowed to have that T-shaped turning space. I know they're a lot less commonly used, but you are allowed these 3 different ones now. The kind of the closest one is you can allowed to chamfer the corners or chamfer the corners, or you can make either one or both of the legs bigger in a couple of different arrangements. Don't see these too often, but be aware that the turning space here has also been changed. The other big change is that the clear floor space size has changed. It is no longer 30 by 48, but 30 by 52 inches. So an additional 4 inches longer. And this has a lot of implications as well. Once again, this is for new construction only. And there's also an exemption in type B units. So now you will have a larger clear floor space in public and common areas and a smaller clear floor space, the original one, in type B units. Where does this have effects? Transfer showers is kind of one of the bigger ones. Distance between obstructed clear widths. That one's a little bit, I was trying to figure out how to word that best. I'll describe that a little bit more as soon as I start talking about accessible routes where I have a visual for it. If you do have accessible routes that are longer than 200 feet and you need to have a passing space, that passing space is larger. It does affect some of the door maneuvering clearances as well, and some of the vertical conveyances. Platform lifts, Lula elevators, if you use those, and then there's some minor things that don't happen very often, like private elevators and gaming machines at casinos or in some of the bars, the video poker. One of the other really big changes, and this one's actually for the better, makes outlets in kitchens a lot easier. This comes up on pretty much every multifamily residential building that we review. In L-shaped and corner kitchens, how do you get accessible outlets in the corner? So the changes are, if the corner of an L or U-shaped kitchen is less than 9 square feet, the outlets in there do not have to be accessible. This is assuming that there are outlets that are accessible on other lengths of counter. The other really big change that always causes a lot of havoc is in type B units, if you have a length of counter, instead of having only one be allowed to be non-accessible, it is now changed where you only have to have one that is accessible. So if you have 3 outlets on a length of counter, you only have to have one accessible. It makes it a lot easier. Unfortunately, this was not extended into type A units or in public spaces. It is only within type B units. But since type B units are typically either 95 or 98% of the units in a multifamily building, it's still a really big change. The key thing, mailboxes serving type B units has been increased from the standard reach range of 15 to 48 to up to 54 inches. The type A unit mailboxes still have to be below 48 inches. Where this comes from is that it is now aligning with the US postal standards. It's USPS standard 4C, if anyone has ever looked at that before. But the reason why it's 54 is that was what was originally developed under the old ADA, the old A117, and under UFIS as well, if you do any sort of publicly funded housing. That reach range was 54 inches, and it was only really decreased to 48 in kind of newer versions of the A117.1 and the newer versions of the ADA, the 2010. So it's kind of relaxing that back to be along with the older standards and to align with the postal standards. Some various other miscellaneous ones. Where else have reach ranges kind of been changed? Fuel dispensers. I don't know how many people actually design gas stations. I'm sure there are people out there. I haven't actually met any of these architects. Emergency personnel devices are now exempted from the reach range. That means that the Knox boxes, fire alarm panels, what else? Sprinkler riser valves, basically anything that is intended to be used by a emergency personnel, which would be ambulance, fire, police, utility companies. So maybe like gas meter shutoffs, things like that. Those are allowed to be outside the reach range. Some other minor things, parking meter signage. It was not something that I have to admit, we had really ever checked for. This is mainly in the public right-of-way. It's pretty rare for us to see parking meters on private property, but that has changed. Children's drinking fountains, occasionally see those in schools, and bottle fillers. Bottle fillers are commonplace. Most everybody knew that they had to be within the reach range. Typically, they're if they're associated with a water fountain, that it's just placed immediately over the lower water fountain. If it's not associated with a water fountain, then it's just within the side reach range of 15 to 48. Basically, they're just making it a little bit more explicit within this code, where it was not explicitly addressed previously. Okay, accessible routes. This is where I had mentioned before about the distance between obstructions on an accessible route. This particular diagram, previously you're only allowed to have 48 inches between the areas on accessible route that were restricted down to 32 inches. Now it's up to 52, so that way there's a clear floor space between these obstructions. A lot easier to explain with this picture. But the key thing here to note is that exterior accessible routes are now required to be 48 inches wide instead of 36. This is pretty much standard in most cases anyway. This is coming out of California, where they had 48-inch wide exterior routes. This is new construction only. The only places where we see accessible routes that are 36 inches tend to be only in multi-family complexes where you have multiple buildings and you're providing routes between the complexes, the different buildings, and especially the existing ones. But a lot of times sidewalks are 5 feet wide nowadays in order to kind of allow passing spaces and just the comfort of having a wider sidewalk. But that would be a key change for any new construction that you should be aware of. 180-degree turns, we don't run into these very often unless you have a large ramp, either exterior or interior. The option 1 and option 2 were already available within the code. They've created a new option 3. So if you're willing to make your ramp width like an inch wider on each leg, you're allowed to cut off about 5 inches from the landing width. Not a huge thing because you already had 2 options. I'm not really sure why they included this 3rd option. I'm not sure what the motivation was, but you now have more options. 90-degree turns. In a 90-degree turn from a 36-inch wide corridor or sidewalk to a 36-inch wide sidewalk or another corridor is no longer allowed. Instead, similar to the T-shaped turning space, you can chamfer the corner as an option 2. You can kind of set it back by a couple of inches per option 1. You can make either one or both of the kind of legs of that L a little bit wider as well. We don't really see this one coming up very often either. A 36-inch wide corridor with a 90-degree turn in it is pretty rare. It would feel pretty claustrophobic. More likely for this to come up is going to be in your exterior sidewalks where it used to be allowed, but since sidewalks are now required to be 48 inches wide, this becomes a null issue. So I'm not sure where this is you might likely see these, but want you to be there. Keep that in your head that you can't do a 36 to 36 90-degree. Dormer and ring clearances. One of the weird things, I've always kind of thought of gates as doors, but now it's explicit in all of throughout section 404 for doorways. Gates are now explicitly doors, so you do have to have your door maneuvering clearance at the gate that is the entry to your dog relief area or your playground or security panels, that kind of thing. All the clear floor spaces for door maneuvering clearances are now 52 inches long instead of 48, especially for that forward approach that is so common at multifamily residences and offices and all of that. There was also another minor change. If you take a look at the drawing on the right, it used to be required that you had to have 12 inches beyond the door in addition to that forward approach to the door itself. That 12 inches beyond the door has now gone away. It never really was used, but they kind of compared it to the drawing on the left where you need to have that 12 inches because they kind of had to turn in order to get into the door. But through kind of talking with people who use wheelchairs, that 12 inches wasn't really necessary. Keep in mind that these extended clear floor spaces are in new construction only. Some minor changes on ramps. The landings, wherever you have an intermediate landing or a change in direction, has to be a 60 by 60 square. Previously, it was required that the landing must be able to accommodate a 60-inch turning sickle, which allowed you to kind of clip the corners a bit. And you can't do that anymore. They also put in some explicit requirements for perpendicular curb ramps and parallel curb ramps and blended transitions. That isn't too big of a change because most people followed the requirements that came down out of PROAG, the public right-of-way requirements that were kind of issued then or adopted by each of the states, highway departments or Department of Transportations. All of that's kind of filtered down. It's all of those different types of ramps are entirely consistent with what's there. Oh, I'm gonna go that way. Other key thing, one thing that is big is previously you would have to have detectable warning strips. Oh, okay. Detectable warning strips at all curb ramps within the public right-of-way. You are now required them to have them at all street crossings within the project site as well. Okay. So that's a kind of a key thing. A lot of people provide them anyway, even though they weren't required to at this point in time. But yes, that's there. And also they just clarify the dimensions of the detectable warning strips too. But those haven't really changed in size. Key thing, if you do work in California, the detectable warning strips in California have just grown by another foot. So rather than being 2 feet by 3 feet, they're 3 feet by 3 feet now, I believe. They made some changes to stairs. Nosing's allowed to be rounded. There's some illumination stuff. However, stairs in the A117.1 aren't scoped anywhere within the IBC, or they're not typically scoped anywhere else. And so I marked this as a very minor change. Yeah, I mean, they aren't really affected in pretty much most designs. These are not required to be done in exit stairwells or at your kind of main stairs in your atria or anything like that. Exit signs, there's some clarification about where tactile signs are required. It's kind of been consolidated all into one place to make it a little bit easier for you to look at. So tactile signs are required in these areas. Hopefully all of you are kind of including those in there up to this point already. Okay, and this is the most inexplicable one that that is in the new code. I'm pretty sure that this is going to get amended out pretty quickly. So back when they were deciding not to increase the size of the elevator cars, they somehow did decide to force how the numbering system in elevators is going to be done. So if you're going to be doing numbers on subgrade levels, such as it actually has to have the negative sign in front of it. And the other weird thing is that you can't have, say, like parking 1, parking 2, parking 3. The letters have to come after the numbers. This is not on the, it doesn't make any sense to me. I'm not really sure what's going to happen with this once it kind of carries forward. This is not in the ADA. It's not in any of the other accessibility standards that are out there. This is something entirely new. Stay tuned for how this gets interpreted in the future. It's a weird one. All right, specific conditions by room type. In type B units, I want to really specifically just mention again, there are no additional restrictions to type B units beyond what is already required. No turning spaces, the increased size, there's just no turning spaces at all. The clear floor spaces can stay at 30 by 48, not the increased size from 30 to 50, 30 by 52. 180-degree turns and 90-degree turns all stay the same. So type B units, keep on keeping on with how you've been designing them. It's really only in the public areas in the type A where these major changes kind of come in. Okay, parking. When you design a parking lot, if there is an accessible route that goes all the way through the parking lot, it has to be physically separated from the vehicular paths. This does not apply to the routes between the parking spaces and the entrances. It's only if the route goes all the way through the parking lot or from one large portion of the parking lot to another one. What does separated mean? It's unclear. The California code has kind of clarified this a little bit more in their July 1st updates. They wanted to see it raised 4 inches above the ground. But here, if there's a planting strip in between, or if there are wheel stops, that might be considered physically separated. Parking spaces. This one's also a little bit weird. The new A117.1 starts talking about on-street parking spaces and kind of providing some technical requirements for what those on-street parking spaces have to do. Though typically this is overridden by the Highway Department or the Department of Transportation and is outside the project site. So the only place where this would really kind of come in is on private roads. The places that I can think of are maybe within strip malls, where you have kind of private aisleways or private roads there. So maybe there. We haven't really seen this applied yet. And what it does is it talks about when you have adjacent sidewalks that are very wide, generally greater than 14 feet, and it only applies to these new sidewalks. Then if you have a parallel approach, you have to have an aisle kind of like a passenger loading zone. It's kind of a weird requirement. I mean, okay, so we think, okay, private street on a project site with a sidewalk that's more than 14 feet. It has to be new. And it's not, the additional thing is that it's not close to a curb ramp at the end of the block. So I'm not really sure where this is going to come in. If you have any ideas about or have done any projects where this might be applicable, please let me know. Other things that are included, rather than just talking about or assuming perpendicular parking, they now address angled parking within it. And they also address explicitly EV charging spaces. EV charging spaces were already applied using the older parking standards. And it was assumed that those had to be there, but now it's just made more explicit. Okay, bathrooms. Minor change, the vertical and horizontal grab bars are now each have their own section rather than being lumped into a single section. The toilet paper dispenser is now measured from the front of the toilet rather than from the rear wall. The A117 in the 2009 version, basically measured it from the back wall in an effort to try and change or advocate for a change to that form of measurement. Because it would be a lot easier because the back wall is always standard and there, where the front of the toilet changes depending upon which toilet model is being installed or has been spec'd. But it started causing confusion because per the ADA, you have to measure it from the front of the toilet, from the rear wall, you have to measure it from, for the A117, you have to measure it from the rear wall. So you had to comply with both requirements. It's going to be a lot simpler now. You just measure from the front of the toilet. Also, there's a new toilet compartment configuration in which you are now allowed to have a door that swings in, but it's a toilet stall that's 84 inches long. So it's a huge toilet compartment. But I think people were really wanting some guidance on why can't we swing a door in? So they created some guidance on it. I doubt that this toilet compartment configuration is going to be used very often. Vertical grab bars will be required in roll-in showers. They were required in transfer showers and bathtubs, but not in roll-in showers, and so they will be done there. Another thing, alternate roll-in shower controls used to be allowed to be installed over the bench, but having it being installed over the bench on which a person is sitting makes it really difficult to actually reach those controls. Now, the good thing, shower doors are now explicitly allowed in Type B bathrooms. Shower doors are not allowed still in Type A units. Also, roll-in and alternate roll-ins are allowed to be the only shower type in a Type B unit. Previously, there was a requirement that the shower in a Type B unit has to be a minimum of 36 by 36 inches. And because roll-ins and alternate roll-ins are only 30 inches wide, there was a lot of question about whether these types of shower entrance are allowed to be in Type B units. And the answer is yes, they can be. It was not the intent of that 36 by 36 minimum to restrict the provision of a higher accessibility bathing fixture. One of the key things on shower compartments, if you're doing public bathrooms, multi-user bathrooms, the toe clearance at the bottom of compartments has increased from 9 inches to 12 inches. This makes it a little bit easier to see under them, so higher security concerns, but it's necessary because of these power wheelchairs. In addition to just being larger, they're also taller in order to accommodate the battery pack that's usually between the wheels. So that's a key thing that you'll want to know on all public bathrooms, multi-user bathrooms. Kitchens. It explicitly states that the clear floor space is no longer required to be centered at a forward approach at a sink. This is a little confusing one, but if you take a look closely at the 2009 code, forward approaches to sinks were never required to be centered. Parallel approaches are required to be centered, but not forward ones. Commonly assumed, and it's good practice to center them for forward approaches, but it's not required. Also, a very minor clarification that instead of having just the controls at the front of a range in accessible and Type A units, you can have them on the side as well. The main intent of that the person is not should not have to reach across the burners in order to reach the controls is still there. And this having them on the side meets that intent as well. In bedrooms, in accessible units, so that'll be hotels, Airbnbs, monasteries, undergraduate dorms, the bed heights are specified now between 17 and 23 inches. How does this relate to the upper bunk in accessible units within dorms? That is an open question. Has not yet been raised, and I look forward to seeing what happens when we have to interpret that. Also, closets that are less than 48 inches deep do not need to have a turning space. They were never required to have one in type B units anyway, but that's now been explicitly made clear in the accessible or the transient units and the type A units. The built-in shelves cannot reduce this width. That's kind of new. Some developers, when they had a closet that was accidentally like 49 or 50 inches deep, say, oh, we're just going to put in a little shoe shelf there in order to make it less than 48. Now, explicitly, that is not allowed to be done. Another key thing, the visual notifications for doors, entry units into accessible units. Typically, that's in a bedroom or in the living room. That has to be switched such that the light, somebody ringing the doorbell will not wake a person up if they don't want visitors and they're sleeping. So those lights have to have a disconnect switch. All right, getting into assembly areas. There's some, because of the increased size in the clear floor space for the power wheelchairs, there's now some adjustments that have to happen in assembly areas when you have accessible seating and the corresponding companion seating. Those have been adjusted for this larger clear floor space. There's still an exception for tiered seating arrangements. Tiers are the ones that have not a sloping aisle, but steps in between the rows. The other key thing is that if a dedicated and permanent sign language interpreter station is provided, key thing is that dedicated and permanent. There are some regulations about what that interpreter station must look like. Has to be big enough to accommodate a person, like size. It has to be visible from most of the audience. There has to be some illumination on that person so they can see the signs. And there has to be visual contrast to the background. So that way it makes it a lot easier to see what the person is signing. But that, once again, that's only if it's provided and dedicated and there for the long term. It's also an interesting new section on classroom acoustics. Key thing is this is only required if the local jurisdiction requires it for particular classrooms. It's not scoped anywhere in the code. This is once again the A117.1 committee trying to advance some new accessibility standards and putting them out there, but they don't really expect them to be adopted immediately everywhere. So this is up to the local jurisdictions to decide whether they adopt these. What's also kind of unique about this is that it is not related to visually impaired and not related to people in a wheelchair. This tends to be more for those who undergo autism and trying to limit the amount of distraction that's within the classroom. So basically each classroom has to have a limit on how loud it can be from both interior for interior reflection, but also sound coming in from the exterior. I am really happy to see this kind of start coming in as an optional element because so much of the time the code focuses only on mobility and people that are completely deaf or visually impaired, and none of these other hidden disabilities. Also, they have kind of defined a wheelchair charging area. It does require to have a clear floor space, the larger one, both in new and existing. And they required an accessible units, or the R1 or the transient units. So that will be your motels, Airbnbs, undergraduate dorms. But I was also scratching my head about where else might we find these. And the only other places I could think about was maybe in grocery stores where they charge them, but also in airports, you might see them. I don't know. I put it as a minor change because we don't see them that often except in the accessible units. And since there's a clear floor space required adjacent to the bed anyway, that clear floor space should already be there. Also, you must have an outlet adjacent to this clear floor space, and that's typically already there anyway, either because of a TTY device or a lamp, or just having an outlet in the wall. So I'm not really sure how this would really affect the design, except that you have to show the clear floor space in your plans somewhere. Some other miscellaneous things. Visual alarms were already required in accessible units, and the pigtails, it was kind of confusing about where that kind of came in. What do I mean by pigtails? The wiring for the visual alarms has to be present, but not the visual alarm itself. And this is in the all the accessible units. It's already required in the communication units to have the strobe, but you have to have this ability to connect the strobe in all the other accessible units. That was there, just not very clear. Some changes to non-glare signage. And if you're taking a look at, if you dive really deep into the signage, they're changing some of the viewing distance measurements. So some of the fonts might have to get a little bit bigger on your signage. One thing that I came across recently is the visual relay service booths. These I ran into in my local credit union. Rather than having a teller, they had this big machine that had a video screen, and it was somebody working, a teller working from home, and it was motion activated. So I walked into this little booth and a teller responded on the big screen, and I could do all of my banking at this big machine. Basically what it's saying is that the booth itself and the machine has to be accessible. Visual barriers at service counters. Hadn't really ever run into this issue before. It has more to do with security. So a service counter is maximum height is 36 inches, but people were starting to put these visual barriers over that. So that way there's a small gap that you had to look over that was on top of the service counter. And those are now limited to a certain height. Also, some small changes to golf facilities and shooting facilities. I don't really work on those that often. They don't come up very often. So be aware that there might be some changes there that you should look further into if you're working on one of those types of facilities. There's also clarification on windows. This is consistent with what was required in the past under the 2009, but it's just made a lot more explicit. And I've kind of broken it out for you by the type of space. So if it's a public space or an accessible unit, once again, accessible being the transient units. If it's intended to be used by non-employees, then you have to have at least one window be accessible. This most often comes up in kind of common rooms in multifamily residential, but sometimes it comes up in offices as well. You need to make at least one kind of window in an office if you have operable windows to be accessible. In type A units, accessible windows are only required if it's required for by natural ventilation. And natural ventilation is only required if you don't have mechanical ventilation within the unit. Most multifamilies that I run into will have mechanical ventilation in the unit of some kind. So that doesn't trigger it very often. Also, if you are required to have emergency escape windows, you need to have that emergency escape window be accessible as well. Though this only comes up in multifamily buildings that have a single exit. So that means it's a maximum of a 3-story walk up that would have this. There are a bunch of those out there. So it does come up there, but if that emergency escape window is in the kitchen or bathroom, it's exempted. Typically they're in the bedrooms. So that bedroom window would have to be accessible in a type A unit. And windows are not required to be accessible in type B units at all. Benches. So there's only a couple of areas where benches are required. to be accessible, that's typically in a sauna and a locker room. And the locker room has to be used for changing, not just for storage. So I suppose a changing room. And this has already been required in the ADA, but not in the A117.1. But the clear floor space has to be located in this configuration at the end of the bench, not in front of the bench. Because this is how people that are in wheelchairs will be able to easiest transfer onto that bench. Lastly, there is a comment change about wheelchair accessible telephones. This is the actual picture that is in the code standard, and I have no idea where they got this picture. I've never seen anybody drive up to a pay telephone in a car before. Not to knock Texas, but this is probably the only place I can imagine it happening. Yeah, so the only real place that we see telephones anymore are in hotels and in hospitals. But the changes there are pretty minor. So if you are working on speccing telephones in one of those two types of programs, take a look at this. All right, and that is the presentation. Just quick little guidance about kind of the things that we do, a lot of it, pretty much anything regulatory related. Yeah. Are there any questions, or did anything kind of come up in the chat?
Yeah, thanks, Joshua. That was great. I look forward to the return of the payphone.
Sure.
Once these new codes get adopted. So first question, let me just get into the Q&A here. So this goes, I'll do them in the order in which I saw them. So this may be going back a bit in your presentation. Okay. When you refer to new construction only, do you mean ground up, or does that also include renovations within existing buildings?
It does not include renovations within existing buildings, but it will include additions. So if you're adding new units to an existing building, that would be considered new construction, but not a renovation of anything that's already been existing. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me. We'll make sure it makes sense to the person who asked it.
Okay.
Kenneth asks, how about door maneuvering clearances from the interior entry door on type B units?
Well, those are still required. But I think that the question is whether those will need to be expanded into the 30 by 52, and the answer is no.
Okay. Chris asks, in instances where this document is different than the ADA, do the requirements of the revised A117 become required when a jurisdiction adopts this guidance?
I'm a little bit confused by that one. So there's the standard that whenever you have the A117 and the ADA and they have different standards, you have to just apply the most restrictive one.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question?
Well,
I'm not sure.
The question may come from the fact that we're a home rule state, so there's, there's a ton of different requirements based on the local authority that has jurisdiction. Yep. And as we were talking before the presentation, this new standard, even though it was published in 2017, is going to start getting incorporated by reference through IBC. Mm-hmm. So, I guess that standard would still apply of which is the most stringent, and
yeah,
it's up to your standard of care as the design practitioner to figure out which is the most stringent.
Yeah, I mean, especially with home rule states, you have to kind of go to each of the various counties and or cities and take a look at what are the additions that they adopt and whatever local amendments that they happen to have. And so just, you have to do that due diligence when you start the project. And we do it every time we start a review, especially in the home rule states.
Chris, if that doesn't answer your question too fine a point, then let us know. We did get a question in the chat. Can we get the slides? Yes, Brenda will send them along to attendees today following the presentation. And then I did notice we had a couple attendees with some audio problems at the top end of the presentation. So if you do need to see that first bit, we have it recorded. We'll have to edit it. That'll take a little while, but I'll ask Brenda if she could put her email address in the chat for those who want to see that first bit that they might have missed on the audio. And then we can get that out to you as well. Would you classify this round of 2017 changes as a major or more a routine revision of the code?
It's definitely a major one, mainly because of the increase of the turning spaces and the clear floor space. Mm-hmm. It's going to have a pretty big impact on buildings.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just think about hotels and all of the mobility units. All the bathrooms are going to get bigger. All the bathrooms in Type A units are going to get bigger. Public bathrooms are going to get bigger. Yeah, and it's pretty big.
What will the process be for any changes? Do these get published on a regular cycle?
Oh, theoretically.
Yeah. Not in reality, though. There's no fixed timeline.
Yeah. So the IBC gets cycled through every 3 years. And the IRC, the building code, the residential code, the fire code gets cycled every 3 years. Because the A117.1 is a reference document and is not kind of contained within that main IBC, IRC, IFC cycle. Mm-hmm. It gets updated more at the whim of the committee. So let's see, there's this 2017 version. The time before that was the 2009. The time before that, I believe, was the 2003 version. So 6 years, 8 years, it doesn't get regulated. So obviously it doesn't get updated as regularly, but it does. I mean, it's an active committee. ICC is generally better about it than the federal government. I mean, taking a look at like FHADM hasn't been updated since '98, and the UFIS, the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standard, hasn't been updated since, I think that one is '86. Yeah. So basically, not regularly, but better than federal government, and not as good as the IBC.
Mm-hmm. On a circumstance like you referenced in your presentation about the naming or labeling convention for elevator buttons, that you expect that to change, is that something that comes out by an interim amendment?
So as the codes or jurisdictions start to adopt this standard, they are allowed to make local amendments or amendments to the standard saying, we don't want to adopt this particular code section. We don't want to scope this particular code section. And so it's an option for each jurisdiction to not adopt that requirement for the elevator button labeling. I would, if I were any of you and had kind of had an activist bent or had connections to the jurisdictions that you work in, I would alert them to this when the 2021 starts kind of being adopted, that this might be something that they want to amend. Yeah. Because you may not be able to actually meet it with any of the manufactured elevators that are out there.
Mm-hmm. And so that would revert to whatever the previous version was.
Yep. Yeah. Or what is more typically what is required in the ADA for public elevators. Yeah. Which does not have this weird button naming order.
Yeah. So that gets back to that question that Chris asked about, if there's a difference, rather than just wait and see what happens, we could actually make their impact to have a difference.
Yeah. And I mean, I also expect that there's going to be a large amount of pushback from developers on certain elements of this because they don't want to make their buildings bigger, and it's going to make them more expensive. So as we start seeing these adopted, expect there to be a big discussion about what happens with which portions get adopted and which don't, and that kind of thing.
Well, I'll attempt to distill this down into one sentence for practitioners. If you are working with a client that has a project in a jurisdiction that adopts the 2021 IBC, you probably need to get to know what's in this code. And that's coming sooner or later. If your project is not on the 2021 IBC in whatever communities you're working in, be aware of it, but it's not necessarily something that you need to design to. Is that a fair statement?
Yep, very much so.
Okay, well, it's great to know what changes are coming and how our designs are going to be adapted to those changes in the future. I want to thank, of course, Joshua for his expertise today. I know you do this a lot, and we're glad to have some of your time just for our audience here in Colorado. And especially grateful to Code Unlimited for all the work they do to support us. And sorry you couldn't take that phone call, but tell the boss everything went great.
Yeah, of course.
And just a couple closing notes to wrap up here. We've got another virtual connect next week. This one is going to be hosted by our AI Colorado Emerging Professionals, featuring a panel discussion on leadership development. Each year we do a cohort called the Christopher Kelly Leadership Development Program, and you're going to hear from the graduates of that program's most recent class on some of the takeaways that they learned. And then the final reminder is our call for entries is open for our honor awards, both for design and community service or professional service. We encourage you to get those nominations in. The deadline is June 15th. So we're looking forward to celebrating all the great work that happens around our state this year. Deadline, June 15th. You can find out more on our website. Thanks again, Joshua. Thanks everybody for attending, and we hope you have a great rest of the week. Take care.
Thank you.